So, as many of you are aware, quadratic voting is a massive part of finance.vote. And we're .vote because it's my opinion that voting is one of the most important parts of the decentralized governance stack. Some people disagree with this. Some people think voting too much is just replacing bureaucracy with a different kind of bureaucracy. But really, what, for me, makes decentralized governance work is social consensus formation. So if we're plugging people into blockchains, which essentially what I think this does, blockchains aren't very good at storing the complexity or computing the complexity of humans. So when you're talking about DAOs are like the human social layer that live on top of blockchains. So you've got a kind of blockchain here, which is like essentially just a very ultra scarce database. So it's an ultra scarce permissioned database or consensus driven database. And as we've seen, certainly with Ethereum, and it's going to happen with all blockchains, each block is an incredibly scarce resource. You can't fit much data in it. You're talking 1-2 megabytes. Everyone in the world needs to share that, right? So the way you gain access to it is by paying to change the state of it. So if you're smashing loads of data into it, and you're just wasting money for the most part. But DAOs are going to live on top of this scarce data layer, and they need to record their important state into the blockchain. Now, DAOs essentially are going to, one of the things that makes them really interesting as an organizational paradigm is that you can have the whole history of decision making of an organization stored. So we can see, why did this DAO do that? And we can look all the way back through its history of decision making and see, okay, they did it for that reason. That doesn't happen in organizations conventionally. Normally decisions are made, there might be some minutes or committee meetings or whatever, but you don't really get the provenance of decision making. But DAOs, the history of their decision making is stored on chain. And what you need to do is find a mechanism for collapsing the complexity of human decision making to numbers. And that's what I think quadratic voting does. So I think it's really important for DAOs. I think it's a way of taking the whole complexity of humans and collapsing it to something that can be stored on a blockchain. All right, so statement number one. If you're unmuted, someone, please just jump off in the background. So yeah, I'm very convinced this is going to be the case. This is a new kind of mechanism for reaching consensus, not just in DAOs, but I think eventually nation-state democracy will use elements of quadratic voting, either through means of polling or actually during the election process. And there's a few reasons why I think that is the case. But I'm going to get into sort of what is it first, right? So quadratic voting is pretty damn simple when you get down to it. So normally you have a democratic system, which is basically you get one vote per person. So the conventional paradigm is one person, one vote. So when you go to the election box or whatever, and you get to pick your new prime minister or president or party, whatever, each person gets one vote. And this is typically done by some kind of ID system. If you're a citizen, you use your citizen ID in order to prove that you deserve one vote or you are allowed one vote, and then you can go and put an X in a box next to a range of options on a ballot. So what quadratic voting does is allow people to have more than one vote. And you can do that by essentially allowing people to buy more votes, which triggers people as a concept. But that's essentially what it. So the original quadratic voting idea was that, all right, let's say we've got these three boxes, but I want to stick more votes in this box because I care about it. So let's say in this scenario, I want to stick 5 votes in the ballot box instead. And if one vote to begin with is $1, then quadratic voting allows you to say, I want 5 votes, but I'm going to pay the square of the number of votes. So I'm going to pay $25 for that vote. And what this essentially does is making it exponentially expensive to vote more than once. So if you want 1,000 votes, it's going to cost you $1 million. So if votes get expensive like this, you can see that people with lots of money have to pay an extremely high cost for each subsequent vote as you get higher up this exponential curve. So that's basically what quadratic voting is in its raw form. Now we've modified that, and there was already considerations of a modified quadratic vote, which we'll get into. But largely what this does is directly attach decision making to economics. So now we're buying votes. So a huge dynamic of this is vote buying. And if you look into the quadratic voting literature, a huge amount of what the narrative has been, what the research has been into, is essentially a theoretical consideration of whether this is better than the conventional paradigm. So is it better to take the brakes off one person, one vote, allow people to have more votes, but attach this economic dimension to the cost and make it exponentially more costly? And most of the narrative has come down to that consideration. People will essentially theorize, all right, there's these groups who are going to start recruiting people to buy votes. So let's say I'm a rich lobbying group. So let's say I'm a lobbyist. And now I'm going to try and I'm going to start raising money to buy votes and recruiting voters to use their votes as well. And what's better? So essentially this happens in the real world anyway. Lobbyists spend money on marketing and they convince people to vote aligned with their interests. So voting is already aligned to economics, but this more directly attaches the vote to a cost. So if vote is now a monetary object, how does that change the democratic system? So contemporary democracy is financialized. Vitalik used this statement not long ago, and I quite like it. He was talking about it in the context of coin voting, and was saying basically if you don't have civil resistance and if you don't have, and are you using one coin, one vote, everything essentially trends to what we sometimes call plutocracy, which is another way of saying financialized. The people with the most money make the rules. But that is already the case. So you can look at any recent election in modern history, and for the most part, the people that won had the most money. And that's because they can spend huge amounts of money changing people's minds. And in fact, this is leveled up since you can probably say the Brexit vote, where Cambridge Analytica proved to the world that you can do what's called micro-targeting. So we just got better at this, right? You can target a group of people and say, I want to change their minds. And thanks to social media, can someone mute whoever is on that? I don't know if Matt, can you do that? So because now our entire perception of the world is determined by what's on our feeds, you can pick people who are likely to change their mind and then literally spam them with mind control until they do. This happened like what, 6 years ago now? Something like that. This has continued for the last 6 years to what we've got now, which is full continual onslaught of people trying to change our mind. So this hasn't stopped. It doesn't happen just around elections now. People do it for trivial shit like making us buy shit coins. It's like I watched like BitClout do this, like to convince people to set up a BitClout account. It's just commodified now. So that this whole thing, it used to be shadowy Cambridge Analytica. Now you can buy this shit off the market for, cheap, right? So contemporary democracy is now completely run by this game, and it's a bit of a mess. So elections as they currently stand are broken because they happen every 4 years. So people are empowered around nation state decision making once every 4 years to make a difference. Now, you can argue that, are you actually making a difference because the parties are roughly the same or significantly overlapping in their framing or whatever? But essentially what happens is, in this period, people are spending vast amounts of money to make you put an X in the box here. And you're just in a constant state of narrative warfare in between every election window. So this is just going to get worse and worse over time. The more we on-ramp onto social media, the more we decouple from contemporary discourse, the less ability we have to have open conversation on the internet because the feeds are controlled by who pays the most money, the more that elections are increasingly financialized and ultimately meaningless. So what we need is new decision-making tools that are censorship resistant and decoupled from algorithmic manipulation. And that's where I think quadratic voting comes in. And DAOs are going to have a huge sort of impact on this. One of the most contested and, I would say, bizarrely warped conversations that we've seen about blockchains is the argument around whether blockchains can be used to improve elections. They can, 100%. I'm not going to take it from anyone that they can't. It's just ridiculous, in my view, to say that they can't. Do we think in the year 2040, 2050, we're going to be going to a polling booth, picking up a pencil and putting pencil to paper and putting that piece of paper in a box where it is physically counted by some people? No, that is not going to happen. It'd be surprised we're using paper and pencil anywhere, let alone in that scenario. Besides, literally thinking of the last election I voted in here, I walked into a polling booth. They said, "What's your name?" I pointed to my name on a piece of paper. They give me a pencil and pen. No ID verification. I don't know how my vote was counted once I put it in the box. I don't know if the people who counted them are bias free. That's it. That's what you put. That's a totally broken system. It's archaic. It's unvalidated, unaudited. There is a degree of auditing, right? There is electoral commissions. You have to presume are bias-free and honest. But there is no way to prove that true auditing has happened on votes using pen and paper. It just can't happen. One of the traps that we fall into consistently with these things is that it has to be perfect. So perfect is the enemy of the good is never more prominent in conversations like this. The question is, can blockchains improve upon a pen and paper, pencil and paper? The answer is yes. Of course they can. Is it easy? Absolutely not. And we've got probably 10 to 20 years of development around these systems before we can confidently say this system is better than that system, even though the current system is really bad. But to say that it'll never happen or it can't happen is completely foolhardy, in my view. So what I see as important work at the moment is how can you use blockchain technology, cryptography, to both improve the voting system itself. Can we do better than one person, one vote? Can we do better than 4-year election spreads? Can we do better on auditing? Can we do better on censorship resistant? Yes, I think all of these things are absolutely possible. Okay, so where did a lot of this narrative come from? Quadratic voting was proposed by two researchers, Eric Posner and Glenn Whale, and they wrote a book called Radical Markets, which absolutely everyone should read. It's a very interesting book. And there's two things in that book. There's a few different ideas. The two things that really jumped out for me when I first read it was quadratic voting and a system called COST, which is something like, I forget what COST stands for now. It's like this stands for self-assessed taxes. It's basically, this is Harberger taxes, which we also develop here at finance.vote. And this is the idea that property, common ownership, self-assessed taxes. And this is built on the idea that instead of everyone having perfectly private property, we have some fantasy world where everything is instead a commons that everyone agrees to share. But again, it's not complete communism where the state owns everything. Everyone do own things, but you simply set a tax on all property you have, and people can buy it from you if they want to buy it at any point. Now, what that creates is a huge pot of money. Let's call it the common treasury. So let's imagine we've got this gigantic commons treasury to spend. How do we spend it? What's important to us? How do we know what the commons wants? You need new kinds of democratic and consensus formation, and that's where quadratic voting comes in. And we're doing both of these things. Finance.vote, we are taking a range of approaches to build a commons treasury. We are going to have a treasury of about 400 million FVT in a pot that our community will decide how to spend, which will be progressively decentralized over time. We're also building our Tribes DAO Commons Treasury, which will capture secondary market sales of NFTs. All of these will use quadratic voting to attempt to discover how to spend our money. Not just how to spend our money, but what do we care about? What's our values? What are we building? What direction are we going into? We're going to use it for all kinds of decision making. So Glenn Whale in this book proposed a different version of quadratic voting. So if you remember, the basic quadratic voting is that one vote is $1, and you can keep buying them for more dollars. Arbitrary costing, you can set it at $1, you can set an exchange rate on it, whatever. But this necessarily doesn't necessarily meet the goal of quadratic voting, which is to give minority voices an equal voice. So the idea is that using these tools, minority voices can be empowered against what's called the tyranny of the majority. Tyranny of the majority is the idea that if you use a standard quorum-based decision-making system, you lose every time if you're a minority because the majority rules. So if you are in a population and you represent 5% of it, so if I'm 5% of the population, like I'm an ethnic minority or in some kind of demographic that's underrepresented through just sheer numbers, then you always lose because there's another demographic that represents 75% of the population. And if you just need 51% of the votes or 50.01% of the votes, then they always win. So what you need is a system to allow those minority voices to elevate their voice if they feel strongly about something. And that's exactly what quadratic voting does. But if you're a minority voice that doesn't have a lot of money, you're 5% of the population doesn't have as much money as the 60-70%. Even with quadratic voting, that doesn't necessarily meet the goals of elevating minority voices. You can always be drowned out just in a more directly financialized manner. So the idea was that you now, instead of having it purely based on dollars, for example, you give every person a budget of voice credits. So now everyone has 100 voice credits, which is like a derivative asset. It's like a new currency. We give everyone in the country or everyone in the system a budget of, everyone starts on the same budget. And now throughout the year, you have a series of referenda where we vote on things like healthcare, education, various other sort of policies like gun rights or whatever, right? Now, what this allows you to do then is spend your voice credits on things that you care about. So if I care loads about education, and I do, I would spend maybe a quarter, 25% of my voice credits by voting 5 times on education policy. I think we should spend our Commons treasury on education. And it's even possible in some cases, like I really don't like guns, so I'm going to vote negative 5 times on guns and spend 25% of my voice credits on that. And this, I think, is a real innovation and adaptation of it. And it's something that we use on finance.vote versions of it. When this gets interesting is now this allows you to, this budget can act as a kind of reputation system where actually not everyone gets 100 voice credits, but differential actors in the system can have different amounts based on their history of decision making in a prediction market or socially validated work or whatever. This is a hugely powerful idea, in my view. One of the problems with this system is that you either need to say what all the referendum are coming up in the future far enough to know what to spend your voice credits on. So there might be a referendum here that I really care about. I've just blown all my voice credits on education. And we go, actually, this represents my minority viewpoint, and I didn't know it was coming up. And there's also a kind of recency bias. So let's say the health referendum is coming up. Everyone's blowing loads of money on advertising health and like vote for health. So I blow all my voice credits on this. And actually, the thing I really cared about was down here. So what we've created is a modified quadratic voting that we call semantic ballot voting. Very similar idea, but instead of this idea of sequential referenda, we use semantic tags that represent anything with meaning. And each ballot is a self-contained ballot with a budget of voice credits that could be variable depending on who you are. And you get to apportion your voice credits in any way you want, delegating your preferences across anything with meaning, any hashtag, essentially. And what this means is that if you're taking a list, so I give you a list, tags, and you've sorted them by preference. Now I can add up everyone's preferences. And what this means is I get a sorted aggregate preference list of consensus. What do we all care about? Not what this on its own creates what I care about, and this is what we care about. And I think this is like a really interesting version of quadratic voting that is going to be exceptionally useful for DAOs. One of the biggest implications or requirements for decentralized organization is the formation of consensus around what we care about. And that's what I think we've built. More than that, and this was almost a happenstance, I was experimenting with this stuff about 4 years ago in institutions, giving it to deans to decide on what they were doing. So I would say, okay, we can do these 10 things. You vote on this, and we'll decide which of these 10 things we want. And what would happen is that these 2 things that floated to the top, people went, yeah, actually, I'm quite surprised that I thought it turned out that this was the most important thing. And sometimes the thing that we talked about most, the thing that the institution thought was the most important thing, by consensus turned out to be the least important thing. That allowed us to eject things that we were wasting our time on, and allowed us to focus our minds on things that actually it transpired we all collectively thought were important. But the process of it, the process of voting itself, allowed you to come to decisions on what you actually cared about. So you move from a state of not knowing what you cared about to knowing what you cared about. So if doing a voting action takes you from a state of not knowing to knowing, that's what's called a cognitive technology. It improves thinking. This, I think, is probably the most important thing about everything we're doing, because people don't think unless they're prompted to think. You don't know what your preferences are until you're asked to order your preferences. So cognitive technologies, I think, are really important. I think we've got at the moment is what I consider destructive cognitive technologies, where we're moving from a state of knowing to not knowing. The opposite is the case. We go from a position of logic and understanding to a state of confusion. And that's what's happening on social media every single day. This, I think, is a constructive cognitive technology. It will help us understand things better, not worse. So, more than that, it promotes nuance. So, if I asked you to come to an election box and pick this box or this box, yes or no, red or blue, we split our decision making into two worlds. There is only two worlds that we are allowed to live in. We Brexit or we don't Brexit. We're Democrat or we're Republican, Labour or Conservative. There's division implicit in binary voting. In quadratic voting, we have many worlds that can happen. And in fact, they can exist in a kind of superposition. All of these things can happen, not just two things. So simply diversifying the possibilities of a vote outcome can create nuance. I'm going to check in with everyone here at the moment. Is everyone following me? Anyone got any thoughts, questions? I'm not talking to myself, am I?
I'm with you.
Oh, here.
Good.
Yeah, I'm with you.
Good. All right, shall I keep plowing on? And then we'll have a chat about it at the end. Right. If there's anything in the world that's missing at the moment, it's this. You can look at people's preferences, certainly in America, and people are starting to split in two camps like this, where this camp and this camp, this is your sort of medium views, these are starting to separate. You need to pick a side, right? And once you're in this side, there's like extreme views on either side that start to become more and more normalized. So people end up in this view and we're just starting to fall out with one another really badly. Because we have a binary tendency of thinking. Binary thinking is what's called a cognitive distortion. The world is not binary, it's complex. It's not this or that, it's normally many things at once. But this allows us to feel more comfortable. And then once you're in this bubble, there's a propensity to move towards the extremes because that's where the dopamine is. That's where the energy is. That's where the anger is. That's where the excitement is. And of course, that's where social media companies make their money. So there's an implicit force on the world at the moment to push us towards extreme modes of thinking, when actually we need to be thinking more like this. We need to be reaching consensus in the middle. Both of these people have a point. This is pluralist thinking, right? You can say, if you position yourself in camp A, you hate camp B, right? You think everything that B thinks is wrong. But actually, these two camps exist because they both have a point. Both of these camps are onto something. They would not form a bubble. They would not form consensus within their thoughts if they didn't have a point. So reality is both people have a point, and what we need to do is find consensus on who are the loons in this group, who should we ignore, and who are the sensible people in the group. What's this position of overlap that's important? And I think what we've built here will help us find out what that is. The other thing that we're doing, which, as far as I'm aware, no one else is adding voting and dialogue together. So in our voting tools, I ask you to say, here's 5, here's vote on 6, but why? And this creates quantitative data and qualitative data. This is just basic research methodology. If you want to find out what people think with nuance, with any kind of depth, you need to be able to put things into plots. Here's some data that gives us correlation and causation ideas, And then qualitative data gives us what's called rich data. The reasons why people fall on that plot. This is something that does not happen in elections. It barely happens in polling. And you certainly never get the two things combined together. And that's why we ask people to justify their votes in our voting system. This is a winning combination. And we could spend 50 years understanding what that system will do to decision making. So, what's the problem with this? Quadratic voting breaks if you can easily split your votes across 1,000 accounts. So, in one person, one vote systems, you need to validate that this person is one person. Certainly, if, let's say, you're the millionaire and you're trying to buy your 1,000th vote, and that 1,000th vote costs you $1 million each. If instead I can split my vote, set up a new account, that one vote costs me $1 again instead of $1 million. So obviously that's what I want to do. So a lot of people have abandoned the quadratic voting idea early doors because they couldn't think of a solution for this without resorting to hard KYC, scanning your eyeballs, uploading your passport data. Aiming for perfect voting, perfect quadratic voting, is a bad idea. You can't win. You cannot beat the Sybils without resorting to extremely draconian KYC, hard doxing. It just ends up, and all of that stuff ends in surveillance. Extremely nasty surveillance. And surveillance ends in dystopia. There is no way that surveillance technology doesn't have bad outcomes, because the people who control the surveillance technology can use it to control people, and they will do. It's too much power to not lead to corruption. All power leads to corruption. Surveillance is power. So what you need to aim for is a war of attrition. You can't win, but you can make it costly. So we use something called decentralized identity tokens, where instead of just an address, an Ethereum address, being a voting ID, now I can set up with a bot 1 million of these in a minute. So that's not going to stop anyone. In fact, it's super easy to create a new identity in permissionless systems. It's easier than it's ever been anywhere. So instead, we use an NFT, which you have to pay for. And that at the moment has base cost. It's not much. It is at the moment because of gas. Let's say all in, it's about $50. Now, when Sybils come to attack your system, let's say all of a sudden we have a vote within the finance.vote DAO that everyone is interested in. So we're voting on what our next tribe is in Tribes DAO, and all the blockchains decide that this is a very desirable thing to have, so they start sending their boys in to vote for them. Now, let's say that all happens in one go. We use an auction mechanism which sends the price of this exponential. And those of you who've been around will see that this happens like this. When people stop buying, the price decays. When people start buying, the price increases. And essentially it goes to a point where no one in the world is willing to pay for it. Not one person in the world is willing to pay that to set up a new account. That's the opposite of it's totally free and easy to do it. And that's what our continuous auction system does. Can you get multiple IDs to do this? Yes, we've got some users with 30 or 40 of them. And if that's the case, they get, instead of 100 voice credits, they get, let's say if they've got 40, they get 4,000. But within that, they're using quadratic voting. By the 100th vote or the 40th vote, something like that, they're using all their voice credits. So one person can have max 10 votes. Someone with 4,000 voice credits can only have 30 odd votes or whatever. They've only got 3x the outsized voting power compared to the first person. Can they transfer their voice credits to different accounts, their NFTs to different accounts? Sure, but that's going to cost them lots of money, and we can see them doing it. You can't win. You can only make it difficult. And that's the approach that we're taking. And we don't have to scan your eyeballs to do it. So how are we using it? We're doing both on-chain and off-chain quadratic voting. For the last year, we've had people voting on a list of tokens. Bitcoin, DAI, YFI, a bunch of DeFi tokens. And what people are doing here is reaching consensus on what tokens they think are going to perform in the market. What's nice about this is the price of this, any one time, is in a completely decentralized way possible to interpret using on-chain oracles. So we use Chainlink. We use Chainlink to validate prices, and in a completely decentralized way have a prediction market based on quadratic voting. Now, in that, and this is the scope of another talk, but we've discovered that there is signal in people's votes each week. It's the opposite of what we expected, which actually, if you counter trade this signal, it's got quite a significant amount of trading alpha in it. But what it does do is create a scenario where we can, on-chain, use this data for trading activity. So next year, we're going to explore how we can use that to balance an index of tokens. One of the things that DAOs need to do is manage their treasury in a decentralized way. And our thesis is that using on-chain votes, a group of people with reputation will be able to out-trade the market and balance a treasury of diverse assets. The winning DAOs will have diverse assets. They won't just hold their own network token, they'll hold Ether, DAI, wrapped Bitcoin, and a whole basket of shitcoins that they've picked up from DAO alliances, which is what we're doing. We're going to hold a treasury of a load of tokens of DAOs that we helped launch. And then at some point in the future, we're going to want to get some of that into Ether or DAI, or go even more long on it, because that's what makes a winning treasury. So that's what we're using quadratic voting for on markets.vote. Outside of treasury assets, we're using it using gasless voting. Using our NFTs, once you've minted an NFT, you can now have budget voice credits. We call them influence credits. We can attach different amounts of reputation by altering the voice credit balance, how much voting power people have, and then use semantic ballot voting to reach consensus, reach a nuanced consensus across a group of people. Where this goes is that we can now have NFT DAOs. Any NFT can be a DAO. And if they've got any amount of financial value, that adds a reasonable amount of Sybil resistance for quadratic voting. And it means that any community with an NFT can reach consensus over what they want to do, what they want to build, everything from complete creative work, curation work, not just monetary policy, but they'll be able to do that as well. And this, I think, is just going to be exceptionally exciting. I think any successful NFT will have a community that has shared values, shared ideas, and a shared direction of where they want that community to go. And we think influence.vote and NFT DAOs is how they'll do it. Next year, we're going to extend influence is the first part of a 3-stage decision-making process. Influence, proposal, decision. What do we care about? What do we want to do? How do we want to do it? And should we do it? We have no idea what we're going to do at this point, but this will allow us to vote on any hashtag. We'll reach consensus on the kind of things we care about. We'll find out that, let's say staking is something that the DAO really wants. Proposal will create a dialogic space where you can form proposals on how you do staking. What staking contracts do we do? Are we going to fund someone to make us a new novel staking contract? Are we going to use yield.vote? Are we going to use some other staking system? How we do it is going to be the proposal system. And that's what's going to happen in proposal.vote. And essentially what this does is, at the moment, the current DAO stack is Discord plus discourse plus the most common one is snapshot. What we're doing is combining that into finance.vote technology. Discourse and snapshot merges into one system where people can reach consensus and execute on, decide on what proposals. In order to do that, we're going to try and pioneer something called semantic governance. You can describe almost anything in the world with what's called a semantic triple. So a semantic triple allows you to say, all right, what are we talking about? If you have 3 categories, one category, subcategory, subcategory. So for us, it'll be things like, let's talk about the yield DApp. Let's talk about its token economics. Let's talk about the pulse length of the liquidity mining. And then I'm going to say, I want to change that to 2000 blocks. Because I've used these 3 semantic tags, the proposal that I make can be super easy to understand. We've drilled right down to what it is we're talking about by using 3 semantic tags. It also defines the scope of what we're doing. If you look at, let's say, Uniswap, they've got $10 billion in their treasury, but what you've got is people saying, I want to do this with it. And they haven't defined the scope of what they will do. So if we define the scope of our dApps, you can't even propose a question or propose something unless it falls within the accepted tags of what we will talk about. And then we have debates over what new tags we'll add to the system. So instead of let's do anything and everything, we're saying this is what we do. Don't even bother suggesting if it falls out of what we do. And that, I think, is going to really improve decentralized governance. The final piece of the puzzle is going to use NFTs to replace M of N multi-sigs. At the moment, the other part of the DAO stack is that we've got Discord, Discourse, and Snapshot, and then a Gnosis safe, normally, a multi-sig. That means that we've got, let's say, 7 people, sometimes 3, sometimes 5. Generally, it's an odd number, who actually control the power. These are the actually powerful ones. This is fine for now, but eventually these people are going to either become attacked for a variety of reasons because the amount of money that they're controlling is vast, or people decide what that DAO is doing is bad, or they're just pretending to be 7 people. There's actually 2 people on it, or even just 1. So what we need to do is broaden the set of people who make the decisions to any number, to what's called a high N. So this is how trustless treasury execution happens at the moment. They typically use 1 coin, 1 vote, but that exposes you to governance attacks, where I can buy enough coins to reach 51% of the decision making and send the treasury to myself. Where I think this improves radically is if we've got NFTs that have earned reputation over time, and although pseudonymous, we trust this group of people to be able to execute on the treasury. So we might have 2,000 NFTs in the governance set, but this 200 are the group that are part of the treasury execution, and we have a quorum of, let's say, a supermajority of 60%. So like we need like 120 of those to say yes, and then we execute from there. This allows you to have fully decentralized, but not just fully decentralized DAOs with complex decision making. We're also exploring the use of zero knowledge proofs and commit reveal schemes for vote auditing. So we'll be able to say, set a vote for a week. So here's a week-long vote. The votes are coming in throughout this week, and we'll be able to record every single block, or every 10 blocks, or every 100 blocks, the state of the vote in that time. And if someone says, hey, you're cheating on this vote, we can pay someone here to go and check the vote state and make sure it aligns with the vote progression over time. This is when we get into like election tech. It's going to be quite interesting. Once you're into that, and we're looking at technologies like Starkware, which use Starks, which are zero knowledge proofs, we can now start to do voting in a private way. This is going to be important for auctions. If you saw the Constitution DAO failure recently, that was because that dude who runs Citadel Capital could see what was in the treasury. They knew their max bid. Using zero knowledge proofs, we'll be able to hide what's in a treasury from outside eyes, and we'll be able to hide the decision to know whether we're going to bid or not. So particularly our decision.vote part of the stack, we want to be private, and we're going to be using zero knowledge proofs to do that. And UV's been deep in research on that for quite some time. We've got some ideas on it. Finally, what does this mean if we've got a nuanced decision-making system? It means we can start to replace where we currently do our sense making, which is a weaponized battleground for our attention and paid media, paid advertising, essentially full-on manipulation war, to a system where we can reach decisions in a censorship-resistant fashion, and we can start to find out what we really think. And that's where I think this stuff ends up. And that's that. I know that was been talking for a long time, but yeah, any thoughts? People stay with me.
I've had this. Oh, sorry, I was going to say I've heard this many times before, Nick, but I'm always fascinated every time you go through it and always learn something new. So yeah, good stuff, man. Any
comments, thoughts, questions? Hang around for a bit and talk about quadratic voting some more. If you want to make any comments, just throw them into the general, and I'll respond to any questions there.
With the sort of roadmap for the next part of influence,
Yeah.
what sort of time frame are you thinking about with execution on that?
So we've already got behind the scenes everything that discourse does. So that whole stack of creating proposals, open foruming, we've already built it. Essentially, we've taken inspiration from discourse, rebuilt it into our code base, and it just needs the UX for it. It needs the. Now I've been talking about this for about 8 months, and it's going to be one of probably the most complex user experience jobs that anyone's ever done. So, because what we're building is a decision-making flow that needs to work for almost any kind of decisions. This is why we're building a group of DAO alliances with a diverse group of people. So we want some DeFi DAOs, we want some investment DAOs, we want some creative DAOs, we want people doing utterly weird stuff that, like, just what kind of decision making are these guys going to do? I have no idea. Then we're going to work with those people to build that UX. So this will start basically in January. Proposal I want completed by Q1. Decision is probably one of the most difficult jobs in cryptography and DAOs. Nevertheless, I think we've got a damn good idea of how to do it. But what we're doing there is essentially doing the part of the stack that is Gnosis safe. So Gnosis safe has something like $100 billion in it at the moment. People trust insane amounts of money in it. So we need to be able to trust Decision, our treasury stack, is safe enough to put $1 billion in. For that, we need to do formal verification, auditing like we've never done auditing before. I won't be able to sleep at night unless that is the most hardened bit of cryptography imaginable. So that bit's going to take a little bit longer. We might be able to get it out. I still think end of next year we'll have that done. You're talking we need probably a $5 million security budget for it. So that those two bits are going to keep us busy from next year. And then once we've got proposal and once we've got a treasury of meaningful size, anyone will be able to make a new .vote app. They'll just be able to apply for funding, apply for a grant, and then I won't even know what's the roadmap is because it goes off into directions that we've never imagined in the first place. So yeah, timelines. We've got 6 apps of the DAO suite basically done and ready for on-ramping DAOs. Now we can on-ramp DAOs, we can build a set of DAO alliances that require complex decision-making. So then we work with those DAOs to do the complex decision-making, co-create that technology with them. And that's an open-ended job. We'll hire people full-time to work with DAOs to build them complex decision-making architecture, and that just goes on forever. But I'm expecting the first group of that to be done Q1 next year. Is any other questions? So someone's asking if the live's ended. I've just stopped sharing my screen. I'm just talking in the voice chat now.
So just to be clear, like essentially you're building as part of the .vote system that's the treasury. That's a Gnosis, like the native Gnosis to FVT.
Yes. I'm not sure yet whether we just use Gnosis Safe and essentially just play in the Gnosis ecosystem as well. Gnosis have a collection of DAO tools called Zodiac that are going to end up very similar to. We're either competitors or not. I don't know yet. If we're competitors, then using their ecosystem might be a risk. So we need to rebuild it ourselves. Also, I'm not sure the signature scheme that Gnosis uses is compatible with the way that we want to do decision. So we might have to build it ourselves. Now, that might be able to be a plugin to Gnosis Safe, or we just create a treasury system ourselves. I don't know yet. Part of that will say, we're going to need a lot of money to do that. So $5 million security budgets on the low end. Gnosis have $1 billion to play with. We don't yet, potentially. So yeah, it depends on a number of possible outcomes. Depends on our traction, depends on our funding. Yeah, potentially we try and do the Gnosis thing. I don't know yet. So Lizzle's asked, I was wondering if we use our voter IDs, a cumulative voice power across different projects. So voters on Stoner Cats can get voice power and then be able to use it on influence.vote. Yeah, one of the use cases of our decentralized identity tokens is that they are usable in any DAO. One of the dApps that I haven't mentioned yet is called identity.vote. And there's perfectly possible that those tokens become transferable across any DAO. And it's possible to essentially port your reputation. If we're in a DAO alliance with Stoner Cats and I've accrued voting power and reputation in potentially even something domain specific, like I've accrued reputation in DAO leadership. And consequently, Stoner Cats say, if you're a DAO leader over there, you can be a DAO leader over here, then absolutely the two things are totally portable. So yeah, and what's interesting about them, they're actually transferable. So you might have accumulated voting power with an NFT that you can sell on the secondary market because it's valuable. Whether that's a good idea or not, I don't know, but we'll find out. There's no way to stop that in all eventuality because you can just essentially give someone your private key and transfer. Yeah, the world's unfair, but you can no way to stop it without doxing people. But yeah, it's one of these things. UV and I hit these endpoints where we're like, do we make the NFTs non-transferable? Well, that means you can't sell them. That means they have no financial value. We don't want that. We want the NFTs to have both aesthetics and utility. We'll know, for the most part, when they've been transferred, unless someone's doing the risky thing and swapping private keys. But there's also this layer of social validation, right? So let's say I'm FET 100. All of a sudden, I've started acting differently. Like all of a sudden, I used to be good, and I'm not anymore. That all of this stuff can be factored into sort of social validation. Project Perish, you trying to ask a question? You should be able to unmute yourself. And
no, I think Ksenia's server muted, so we could just maintain the fidelity
so let's
of sound.
unmute people. If anyone wants to jump in and ask a question, they can do.
Here's a question for you. Massa asked this a bit earlier on. You really touched on this, but there's a final part which I don't think you touched on. Nick, can you tell us a little bit more about the first time you heard of QV? That was the book you spoke about, and why it convinced you. I think you've spoken about that. But what other options did you consider besides QV?
That's an interesting question. I discovered QV. It was before Radical Markets came out. There's a paper called Voting Squared by Glenn Whale and Eric Posner, which I think is where I first discovered it. I can't remember if it was, I read one of Vitalik's very early posts. Like I've just, as a matter of course, since about 2015, 2016, read every one of Vitalik's posts. And I can't pull apart whether Vitalik found it and then that triggered me to read the paper, or I read the paper and we both discovered it about the same time. But I just, as part of being an academic, I read bits, and like I was researching governance, political science, social consensus systems. I've been researching collective intelligence since 2008. So looking for mechanisms, and there was a related group of things like swarm intelligence is another collective intelligence idea. I was researching around that and discovered that paper, Voting Squared. It took me about 3 times to read it, and then there's 2 things that has clicked in my head and been so profoundly like earth-shattering that I couldn't sleep for nights. One was Bitcoin, and essentially concept of proof of work and decentralized money. Once that clicked into my head and I could think in what it was doing, literally couldn't sleep. Like for weeks, like this is mind blowing. The implications of this are mind blowing. And quadratic voting was the other one. Once I can think in something, like visualize it in my head, then I can start to piece the 2 bits together. And actually, when I pieced blockchains and QV together, that's when I really got obsessed on all this stuff. I can't really pull apart anymore. It's just been obsessed on it so long, whether it was DAOs, quadratic voting, or blockchains generally, that's just got me all upset. They're all mulched together in my head now. And yeah, I just got very convinced so I was just thinking about applications of QV for everything from voting on man of the match at football grounds. It was like going to the footy, watching footy and thinking, we should be using quadratic voting to determine man of the match here. And then thinking, actually, that means you can generate player statistics. And then just like applications are just endless. So yeah, it's the legacy of me thinking about it. I don't even know anymore. All I know is I've been thinking about it for 5 or 6 years and can't stop thinking about it. Yeah, and I'm just really pleased to be in a position where I'm now working on it full time. This is for 4 years. I was just desperately trying to end up in a position where I could just do this and build it. And yeah, that's where we're at. And I'm super excited about it. I think people are unmuted now if anyone wants to jump on and ask a question. Project Perish, I think you're unmuted if you want to ask a question. Anyone else while we're figuring it?
Yeah, now people can unmute themselves, because before they couldn't, I think. So I fixed this.
You're still stuck. You might be on push to talk or something. That's normally what blocks people. Get there in the end. Ricardo, I can see you're there. Any thoughts or reflections on this stuff?
Yes. Hi, Nick. By the way, sorry, I think my microphone was open a little bit earlier. Sorry about that.
Oh, don't worry, don't worry.
Yes, quite a few thoughts. Something just off the top of my head, and it's something I didn't really think in detail about at all, but I just wanted to ask you out of curiosity.
Yeah.
Have you considered a double NFT system? One is the commercial art base and might be able to be used in some of the apps, some of the DAO suit apps, yeah. And another one non-transferable for governance. So it's kind of like a double token, double token, so but a double NFT system.
Yeah.
Is it like what the Donut DAO is doing with Contrib or something? Similar.
Yeah, so it's attached to. We thought about decoupling it. So instead of having 2 NFTs as such, you've got an address that minted the NFT, which is essentially non-transferable unless you start shuffling private keys around. And we could have the reputation dynamic to the address rather than the NFT. Now, there's a huge amount of ways that could run in. So where I imagine this going is you have to think in a kind of decentralized development sort of world where eventually this becomes like an open source library. The people just use this stuff in any way that they imagine. And then all of a sudden there'll be like 10 different interpretations or use cases, or I'm imagining hundreds of different ways of using the reputation system, because it's essentially off chain to start with. So, for example, in our markets thing, we've had this very rudimentary reputation system where you just get more voice credits every time you're correct. And that sort of broke everything because the reputation just goes exponential just by playing all the time. So it's there to be improved. Do I think someone will do that and try it out in a DAO or try it out in a mini DAO or try it out somewhere? Yeah, absolutely. maybe we will fund a team to try it out. I don't know. I want to get this to a point where people can start ideating in that space and run with it. And yeah, there's just so many possibilities with it that, yeah, it's already like too big for my brain. I can't take all of it in anymore myself. There's so many possibilities and directions which means you're on a good idea, right? When like quadratic voting is a good idea because I couldn't sleep at night for all the possibilities. And that's where this is going to go. We're just creating the open source framework for people to ideate in. So yeah, if people are interested in doing that, I want to get to the point where we can fund them to go and run off and do it. And I think we should, Ksenia's been talking about hackathon for forever, and I think we do that next year. And we'll have a track on decentralized identity tokens and like, here's the library, here's the tools, here's how you mint the smart contracts, go and play with it. So
Awesome.
yeah, thought about it, we've had that conversation a lot, but you just have to get to a point where you're like, this is good enough for now. There's just good enough is a hugely underappreciated design paradigm in DAOs and blockchains generally.
There's actually a research field in governance called good enough governance. There's governance, there's good governance, and then there's good enough governance.
Yes, exactly. And it's actually a bottleneck that loads of people end up in, where they go, you can Sybil attack this. And there's a big part of that point where, you can't win. I've thought about this enough of how to beat Sybils. 80% of the directions end up in absolute tyranny, and 20% of them mean you just end up wasting your time and resources trying to stop them, and you lose anyway. So just good enough in Sybil protection is like one of the key paradigms. But yeah, just good enough governance, I'm a big fan of. So Mass is asking, as FET growing, more users and DAOs will use dApps, how are you planning to educate them on this relatively new concept? Yeah, so in January, I haven't announced this yet, but I'm going to be setting up a course, which is, a working title is How to Build a DAO. One of the things I've done for a decade, I've validated like hundreds of higher education courses. What I did for a living for many years was spend 30 hours a week in meetings with academics, helping them design educational courses. So we're gonna have a learning DAO as a mini DAO within the finance.vote ecosystem, which makes educational content. Watching all the DAO platforms over the years, it's like they were building DAOs for everyone understood what you could do with a DAO. And the reality of it is that all of these technologies are so radically new that no one can understand them. So what we actually need is DAO leaders, people who do understand it and then can explain it to other people. So that's the idea, is we train people to train people. So there's going to be a course run out of the DAO. We train up DAO leaders, and that means that we can incubate DAOs or help DAOs launch, and we can give them people who understand how to work in a decentralized organization. And like, they can come and convince some of our DAO leaders to go and work for them for a little bit. There might be DAO leaders who work in 5 different DAOs, helping them get off the ground. So it's a great question. Education is going to be absolutely huge bit, and I'm going to make a formal curriculum out of it. It'll be essentially a master's level course that trains people to educate people in DAOs. Then we've got the whole stuff around just mass market education on what DAOs are, and that's where we're going to have a media mini DAO, that's job is to take stuff like what we're doing here and break it down into really understandable chunks of content that can be fired at TikTok and Instagram and Twitter and all that sort of stuff. So I'm pretty convinced next year people are going to be like, what's a DAO? Like, what's block? Like, DAOs are going to... So what Constitution DAO? Something like 10,000 of those people that went into Constitution DAO had never heard of crypto before. Or that was the first time they'd bought Ethereum and gone into it. Just like the first time people bought Ethereum and got into crypto this year was NFTs. I actually think DAOs are going to be a bigger adoption vector than NFTs are. So yeah, we need to be ready to answer those questions. What's a DAO? What's crypto? What's a blockchain? How do I send a transaction? What's MetaMask? We need answers and materials for all of that stuff. So between a sort of media DAO and an education DAO, learning DAO, I think that's how we're going to do it.
Media DAO and education DAO both together as
propaganda. Damn, that's good. Yeah, we need that's a different one. Yeah, propaganda. I love it. Let's do it.
Since our NFTs have a reputation mechanic, how do you assign reputation in a decentralized way?
One of the toughest questions there is. We've done this in markets. It's not very good reputation factor, but it is a decentralized reputation factor. I think it's one of the first. So we've done one. And the way we did that was take objective data determined from Chainlink, match your decision making to your performance. That's a totally decentralized reputation factor. Not a good one, but actually I think it's not that far off from being a good one. We just need to add in a decay factor to it. So it's just better at connecting your performance of decision making over time. So when it comes to things like objective data, like this was a good decision or this wasn't, it's doable. You need oracles to do it. When you don't have an oracle to do it, you then have to replace that with social validation. So what we might be able to do is like an idea. Sorry? So yeah, social validation is built on, there's like a paradigm called web of trust, where, so if I say Lenny is good at design, Lenny's good at product design, and so does Ksenia, and so does Massa, and so does Ricardo, that's one way to build up decentralized reputation, is socially determined web of trust like models. And we haven't had to credentialize you, we haven't had to check your LinkedIn, we haven't had to check your qualifications, any of that stuff.
But it's when people validate each other, web of trust. Yeah. I validate you, you validate this person, and so on and so forth. It breaks because because people don't come to consensus over validation rules. I can validate you by my own rules. So web of trust, it's a whole rabbit hole.
It is a whole rabbit hole.
What comes to mind? Are like Reddit karma points, like karma points on Reddit.
Yeah, to a certain degree, karma points are a decentralized reputation system. Not a very good one. Again, it's just really difficult because now you're trying to quantify subjective parameters. Yeah.
Parrish is trying to talk, but for some reason she or he cannot. They cannot.
Yeah, Project Parrish, if you want to, yeah.
You can just write in general.
Want to just write a text question? Happy to do that. Struggling with it. No, you didn't, Project Parrish, don't worry. If you want to ask a question, just type it in the general.
I have a quick comment on decentralized reputation here, Nick, and I'd like to hear you on this. So, from what I understand, and I don't know much about this yet, applied to blockchain as applied to crypto and blockchain, but my impression is that trusting the swarm, trusting the community on decision on reputation making, reputation building depends on having an efficient way for people to form their own opinions. Because if people are tricked and people can easily be tricked into forming different opinions on things, then this whole system doesn't work.
Yes, this is why you need decentralized sense making. So I think quadratic voting is going to play a huge role in it, because let's say, and relative ranking. So let's say let's take our creative content vote. we've got 10 people we've got like 50 people making memes, right? We take those 50 memes and stack them in a vote, and then we reach consensus on who made the best memes. What we've done there is relatively rank 50 people on their quality of content production. That's one way of assigning a reputation factor, potentially. So the quadratic voting is actually a route into decentralized reputation, in my view, because it allows you to relatively rank and weight people's work across a specific dimension or domain. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I'm a big believer in hybrid systems. Yeah, I'm not.
Yeah.
I don't yet fully believe in on chain or off chain, but for the moment I'm a believer in hybrid systems.
Yeah, I built a hybrid decentralized organizational structure inside a institution, and that was the innovation. So I knew I couldn't disrupt the pyramid at the center of the organization. There's a chain of command. There's the vice chancellors, the vice chancellor, the pro vice chancellors, the committee leaders, of which I was one, and then the committee members. There's a pyramid. There's a chain of committees. There's a hierarchy. And what I did was build a decentralized structure alongside it and make them talk to each other. I think that's hybrid organizational structures are going to be absolutely massive over the next 20, 30 years.
Yeah, I agree.
So I think large organizations, institutions will have a DAO inside them where anyone in the world can come get part in it, and it gets to like tap into a global workforce, global collective intelligence, remote workers, have its own treasury, and just work alongside a hierarchical power structure, and ultimately be not fully autonomous, but will be a decentralized organizational structure. So yeah, that whole interplay between hybrid organizations and decentralized organizations is like incredibly powerful, I think.
There's a paper or an article by a professor called Archon Fung. I think he's from Harvard, I'm not sure. And it's really cool. It's one of the models that I like the most about governance models. I really like. It's called the Democracy Cube. I was thinking of sharing this during this sometime this week or next week, so that maybe we can talk about it, discuss it.
Yeah, let's stick it in the read. Maybe we should do our reading group on it next week. I'd love to see that.